So I want to start by saying thanks so much to Carlos, who has been so wonderful and helpful in facilitating having me here today, as well as to Nicola and to other people at Studio X. It's exciting to be talking about my book with all of you today. It's particularly exciting because you're the first group of people that I'm talking about this as a book, as opposed to as an ongoing research project that I have been thinking about in a variety of ways for the past 10 years. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how I got to this project, how I found myself doing this research and went about writing the book. And then I'm going to give to you, I'm going to read actually some excerpts from the introduction that provide an overview of the book's project, trace some of its overarching theoretical and historical frames, and then gives you a whirlwind walk through the chapters that it covers. And then afterwards, I hope to give us lots of time for conversation and questions where you can ask me more about the specific case studies that this project looks at, and if you want, which after you've heard me talk for 30 minutes is highly unlikely, I can also read a tiny bit of an excerpt from some of the chapters if we want. So the way that I first came to this project actually was far earlier than the years when I began its research and its writing. And I would sort of place its origins in the 1990s when I, and perhaps some of you during the 1990s, but also throughout the 2000s as well, found myself in a series of cities observing a series of often upsetting conflicts. This started in the mid-90s for me when I was living in San Francisco and spending time at a then brand new bar called the Lexington Club, which some of you may have heard of, which is a queer bar located in the Mission District, a neighborhood that has been gentrifying still to this day, but in different stages of gentrification since the 1960s and 70s. And then a series of conflicts that I encountered in the late 1990s when I was living in Brooklyn at also a now gone bar, which probably few of you would have heard of, The Rising, anyone? Which was a lesbian bar on cafe on Fifth Avenue in Brooklyn's Park Slope. And in both of these bars, there were a series of conflicts in which violent acts against lesbians who were coming to or from the bar were met by bar owners taking a response of wanting to organize in lesbian protection by turning primarily to strategies of calling for increased policing in the neighborhood and also uniting with new business owners in these very same neighborhoods as a way to call for protection in neighborhoods that were facing arguably high levels of policing and gentrification already. Jump ahead to the early 2000s, and I'm living still in Brooklyn at that point, now in Washington, D.C. And I heard about a meeting that was being called by an organization, which some of you might be familiar with, called FIERCE, which stands for Fabulous Independent Educated Radicals for Community Empowerment, which had called a meeting in the former St. Vincent's Hospital, now slotted to be condominiums, I believe, is that correct? Where residents in that neighborhood, many of whom were not lesbian or gay identified, were using the same language of protection and calls for safety, this time targeting LGBT youth, many of them of color, in the neighborhood, who they were understanding to be the source of violence rather than those that they sought to protect. I ended up meeting up with Fierce folks and working in later years as an ally to that organization for a couple of years. But I became interested in beginning historical research to ask, how did this neighborhood and neighbors in Greenwich Village, many of whom were straight identified or heterosexually identified, manage to use the language of gay protection to target LGBT youth? Why, another question I had, were no anti-violence organizations, LGBT anti-violence organizations in sight? And also, relevant to those of you who are planners in the audience, why was the community board, a mechanism of city regulation and control and participation that was founded in the 1960s and 70s to allow for the opportunity of bottom-up participation in planning, delivering reforms or demands to a neighborhood that would transform it to make it even unaffordable to those very residents living in the neighborhood. Greenwich Village, like most of New York City, is primarily a renter economy, despite the high levels of high-cost properties in the area. So I was interested in how the community board had transformed in this way. So while I continued to spend time as what is called an ally to Fierce, supporting them within sort of actions that they were doing that they determined for the sort of current campaigns that Fierce was taking on, I went about trying to set out to find this historical trajectory. Looking first at the history of anti-violence organizations, what organizations fed into the history of anti-violence organizations, which it turns out were Gay Safe Streets patrols, and going back to earliest gay organizing in the 1950s and 1960s. I will also, and I'm going to skip over that here, but brought me to a wide array of both university and community-based archives that collect both the official records of large lesbian and gay organizations. The NGLTF's papers, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force's papers, are held at Cornell University, and small community-based archives across the country that hold the papers of smaller queer groups, including the Gay and Lesbian Historical Society in San Francisco and the Lesbian History Archives here in New York City. I'll also add as one last little personal note that I think that I'll only share here as with a group of people who some of you be planners, some of you be architects, some of you be artists, some of these. Okay, this is not something that I would normally share, but I'm, as somebody who is a child of a progressive urban planner who has thought very, very cynically about what kinds of promises design may or may not give, while myself is also committed to the promises of a certain kind of aesthetic utopianism that social movements might provide. There's also a deep personal history to this project. Okay, so I'm now going to jump right into reading some excerpts from the introduction, and that'll just be for a tiny bit, and then we can open up for a conversation. Okay. So, on May 6th, 2002, residents, business owners, and politicians staged a rally called Take Back Our Streets in Christopher Park in Greenwich Village. Did I do it? No.
I think it's backwards.
No, yes, great. In Christopher Park in Greenwich Village. The location chosen was symbolic. The park is located at what had been the center of the Stonewall Uprising, the famed riots of June 1969 that have been central to many legacies of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender political organizing. Yet in recent years, the memory of Stonewall as a long overdue, passionate expression of selfhood often omits that, first and foremost, it was a collective challenge to the police, and but the latest clash in an ongoing struggle. Furthermore, the gay liberation organizations that arose in the aftermath of the riots believed that protection from the police would depend upon coalitions with other radical movements, including Black Power, women's liberation, and Third World decolonization. This was in contrast to the approach taken by their predecessors, homophile activists who advocated for police accountability through liberal reform measures. Consequently, the Stonewall refusal to collaborate marked not only a rejection of social assimilation, but was also in defiance of the partnership solutions to urban conflict that had been popular with policymakers in the 1960s, such as community policing and war on poverty initiatives. Over 30 years later, the 2002 rally had a very different aim in mind. It was linked to a campaign for the enforcement of quality of life laws, which target low-level offenses such as noise and loitering, and had been the hallmark of former Mayor Rudolph Giuliani's anti-crime policy. Proponents included Residents in Distress, RID, named after an insecticide, the Christopher Street Patrol, an anti-crime group supported by the Guardian Angels, and officials from the local community board, which, as many of you know, is New York's neighborhood-based governing structure. Supporters claimed that boisterous crowds and sex and drug trades were fomenting a threatening culture of crime and violence in their neighborhood, that part of Greenwich Village best known as the West Village. In meetings, rallies, and media blitzes that would stretch throughout the first decade of the 2000s, residents complained that their neighborhood had been taken over by, and I quote, the Bloods and the Crips, the dealers, hookers, pimps, and johns, vicious drug dealers, and hostile transgender prostitutes, and rowdies, all of whom constituted, quote, an army of occupation, end quote. The most public members of the campaign were white, and the areas they cited for cleanup were the very same places where people of color, many of whom identify as LGBT, have long socialized. Residents' primary focus were the neighborhood's waterfront piers, right nearby at the end of the famed Christopher Street, the place of a mostly Black and Latino social scene that had been pushed out of nearby Washington Square Park under resident and police pressure during the 1980s and 1990s. Residents also named as undesirable activity outside the entrance to the Path train station, which connects Newark and Jersey City, both of which are majority Black and Latino, with Lower Manhattan. Some residents were also involved in a campaign against the expansion of Path exits into the designated Stonewall Historic District. The fact that residents' main opposition was to LGBT youth and transgender adult women of color was not only coded in their choice of targeted geography. One resolution explicitly named the problem as, quote, rowdyism resulting from large crowds of young people, mostly LGBT youth of African American and Hispanic origin, end quote. While in public, residents denied that their complaints were, quote, racial, almost all media coverage of the situation, sympathetic and critical, was clear that those considered a problem were people of color and those presumed to be engaged in prostitution were also transgender. Yet residents were also insistent that their efforts were not anti-LGBT. This claim was supported by those who called for the protection of the Stonewall Historic District, as well as those who would invoke the history of anti-gay violence to bolster their fight against undesirable street life. Moreover, they advocated for the very strategies that have been promoted by LGBT anti-violence activists since the 1970s. From safe streets patrols and community watch efforts to calls for increased police presence and enhanced criminal penalties, tactics that also parallel shifting approaches to urban crime control during these very same years. The result is that the demands of Greenwich Village residents and a now national LGBT anti-violence movement can look strikingly alike. Safe Space asks how this neighborhood-based convergence of anti-crime and LGBT rights strategies came to pass and why it matters. Far from simple circumstance, the debates in Greenwich Village bring into focus an entwined history of LGBT activism, gay neighborhood growth, and US policy responses to urban poverty and crime over the past 40 years. By treating the construction of violence as central to both US LGBT and urban politics, I ask how the ideal of safe space, something we hear very often, has shaped LGBT social movements, but also the administration of those cities where those very policies so frequently coalesce. I look at how violence and safety have influenced changing concepts of LGBT identity, as well as policy and social science research on neighborhoods and social deviancy, from the legacies of war and poverty programs to quality of life laws, from debates about the so-called culture of poverty to the concept of homophobia. More generally, Safe Space argues that an analysis of the goal of LGBT safety in the city is important to understanding not only the transformation of LGBT politics since the 1960s, but also the development of space at various scales during the decline of a certain model of liberalism in the US. Since the 1960s, the state-based policies of social welfare and economic regulation that characterized post-war liberalism were targeted by the ascendancy of the ideals, if not always the practice, of a pure free market championed by neoliberalism. One feature was the continued decimation of and then selective reinvestment in central cities, a process that has repeated and sustained over the years. Recurrent too in this cycle has been the declaration by policymakers and political pundits that white gay populations might in fact hold the key for the rejuvenation of struggling metropolitan regions. In the 1970s, for example, gay men were extolled as saving declining central cities as vanguard members of the vaunted Back to the City movement. And in the late 1990s and early 2000s, gay populations were again invoked as draw factors for the creative class of workers that might revitalize restructured urban regions. Success. In each example, gay men, and less so lesbians, were seen as the arbiters of risk, their vulnerability or solution to violence as a measure of an urban region's vitality. Thus, central to this history is the assessment of risk, the risk of violence associated with gay vulnerability that calls for crime control, as well as the risk of lost profit associated with real estate speculation, and how both shape the conditions of possibility for normative gay community belonging and the land market. Ultimately, this book argues that in mooring a dominant understanding of sexual identity to place, the promotion and protection of gay neighborhoods have reinforced the race and class stratification of post-war urban space. This has been enabled by the at once flexible and fixed language of threat, in which violence is imagined as the key risk, and thus the defining feature of gay visibility, the key term of mainstream LGBT politics since the 1970s. It's therefore impossible to understand LGBT political history outside of the social and spatial restructuring of US cities during this time. Nor can one fully understand changing spatial development patterns apart from LGBT politics, especially as to this day, white gay men continue to be invoked as arbiters of quality in urban life. Finally, these dynamics are not restricted to cities or US borders, as they speak to the at once global and local effects of uneven development alongside the travels of US-centered models of LGBT identities and movements. But much to all of our relief, I think, Safe Space is not only a story of the vexed legacies of post-war liberal policy and the triumph of neoliberal ideology. It is also an analysis of those who struggled with and against each in imagining LGBT and queer futures in all sorts of places. Although I do assert that mainstream lesbian and gay political discourse has substantially transformed the category of what we understand to be anti-gay violence from the social to the criminological, and that this was grounded in privatized claims to neighborhood, the process was neither foretold nor total. Activists debated different definitions of violence, and they staged their critiques in varied contexts, in cooperation with civil rights leaders and in solidarity with revolutionary nationalists, alongside feminists as well as crime victims, through public agencies and in radical collectives, in the name of state-based redistribution and for the end of the US nation-state. While my coverage is far from complete, I signal the existence of a wide mix of LGBT and queer-identified urban activism against violence. So now I'm going to just give you a whirlwind overview of the chapters, and then we can open up for some conversation. So the first chapter begins with two campaigns from the mid to late 1960s that included the leadership of homophile activists, early gay activists from the 1950s and 60s who were active in San Francisco's Central City. In the first, homophile activists collaborated with other reformers to demand that the neighborhood be designated a target area under the Johnson administration's war on poverty. They did so by asserting that one part of the Central City, the Tenderloin, was, quote, a white ghetto of prostitutes, transsexuals, hotel loners, and homosexuals who faced the same problems, apparently, as did people in low-income areas that were a majority people of color. In the second case study, homophile activists were among those who banded together to found Citizens Alert, one of the nation's first citywide homosexual inclusive police watchdog organizations. Here I show how the 1960s San Francisco fight against poverty and state violence provided an opportunity for white homophile activists to participate in forms of cross-identity coalition at the same time as they leaned on a limited analogy between the social regulation of white sexual outcasts and racial minorities. In particular, I examine how the focus on individual psychology central to the racial liberalism in the post-war period facilitated these connections and provided the groundwork for a model of gay liberalism that would prove lasting in decades to come. The chapter also considers the activities of a small radical organization of street youth, Vanguard, which inverted at the same time as it replicated many of the key terms of homophile activism. And that's them doing a street cleanup that would resemble in many ways the kinds of terms of activism that organizations would take up 40 years later. Because none of these coalitions were exclusively gay-focused and they took place during the years the homophile movement has been described as fading, they have received little attention. Moreover, the combination of social justice theology, Alinsky-style organizing, countercultural expressions, and various degrees of state-sponsored uplift delegates these efforts to an indeterminate, if also familiar place in 1960s left liberal politics. This is especially the case since the key players did not abide by many of the standard-bearing definitions of radical and conservative, collaborating with activists who called for the end of state institutions at the same time as they forged state participatory solutions. These are advocating assimilation while assailing cultural norms. These seeming oppositions were a product, to be sure, of the conflicted promises posed by the war on poverty and its own emphasis on community participation. It also reflected many of the debates that marked the history of the civil rights movement in general, which Central City activists held as a model. Ultimately, these dynamics will demonstrated the contradiction of consolidating gay identity in order to gain recognition from a federal anti-poverty program, a dynamic that unhooked even as it depended upon the links between homosexuality, transsexuality, and other so-called deviances associated with urban poverty, as well as the shared experience of state violence among a variety of marginalized city dwellers. In contrast to the homophile drive for state recognition, gay liberationists at the end of the 1960s refused what they saw to be the placating efforts of urban social policy, despite a shared conviction that violence was linked to unchecked police power. Early gay liberation was closely linked to the New Left and stood in solidarity with anti-imperialist, revolutionary nationalist, and radical indigenous activisms. These other movements tended to center a critique of state violence and to support self-determination based in place claims. Gay liberationists, on the other hand, extended this stance through an interpretation of violence as that practiced and sanctioned by the state, and they trumpeted the reclamation of gay neighborhoods from mafia and police control. But as this was increasingly conjoined by a call to see gay men and lesbians as on the side of the law rather than as criminals, individual violence became an amorphous category, as did the potential new locales for new gay territories. The second chapter of the book opens with a discussion of the shifting definitions and approaches to violence held by gay liberationists, marking in particular how race and sexuality analogies were used to theorize the problem of violence, but also to stake land claims. As the 1970s continued, lesbian and gay organizations multiplied, as did divisions between them. Activists debated core ideological issues, including multi-issue versus gay-centered approaches, the place of communist and socialist visions, and the role of race and gender in structuring anti-LGBT oppression. Chapter 2 considers the growth of a new gay rights model in the mid-1970s that I dub militant gay liberalism, that combined the militancy and countercultural performativity of gay liberation with a gay-focused, reform-oriented agenda. Neither far to the left nor complacent in their liberal goals, these organizations arose to address a range of issues that activists understood to directly and uniquely impact all gays and lesbians, such as street violence and the need for designated neighborhoods. The chapter focuses on a series of gay safe streets patrols, such as the Lavender Panthers and San Francisco's Tenderloin, which were quite a spectacular bunch, the Butterfly Brigade in the Castro neighborhood, and, which I don't have a good picture of, the Society to Make America Safe for Homosexuals, SMASH, in New York's Chelsea. And all of which postdated the heyday of gay liberation and predated, though, the consolidation of national civil rights organizations. These patrols ranged from quests for self-determination to ad hoc gatherings of self-proclaimed vigilantes, all of whom hoped to assert and protect something they called gay space. Here the book also explores the parallels between social scientific studies of urban violence and poverty with the growing circulation of the term homophobia. I examine how the lasting influence of the psychological basis of post-war liberalism, in particular the culture of poverty thesis, shaped the consolidation of the new discourse of homophobia through a shared emphasis on the supposed psychopathologies of damaged masculinity and low self-esteem. Also, during these very same years, community policing and things like community boards in the form of neighborhood patrols became popular among both middle class and gay activists. I consider how these patrols were inspired by the participatory ideals of post-war liberalism, but took shape in the 1970s in the context of the rising influence of conservative rational choice theories that take crime as pre-given and shift the focus to punishment and the management of victims. As such, gay safe street patrols were part of a broad process that first began the process of transforming gay spaces from places of residential concentration to expanding niche markets for retail commerce and real estate speculation, each firmly in place by the end of the 1970s. I'm almost done with that. Gay safe streets patrols learned from feminist models, in particular anti-rape activism. Yet at the same time, many lesbian feminist organizations were in fact taking a very different approach to the topics of violence and urban space. Around the same year as militant gay liberal visions were congealing and achieving some power, most famously with the 1977 election of gay supervisor Harvey Milk, others were pointing to the contradictions inherent to a solution to street violence based in crime control and the protection of gay neighborhoods. This was a critique sustained by a variety of organizations, but most especially LGBT groups whose membership was also active in other movements, including Black Power, radical feminisms, revolutionary nationalisms, anti-colonialisms, and Marxist-Leninist and Maoist parties. Chapter 3 begins by returning to the time of Stonewall and then moving quickly through the 1970s to mark organizations that centered analyses of race and gender in explanations for lesbian, gay, and/or trans marginalization. The chapter then hones in on the turn of 1980, when many of these trajectories merged and gained traction in a series of organizations that theorized the place of race, gender, and sexual identity in public contestations over anti-gay violence and gay participation in gentrification. I also show how these groups pointed to the contradictions of militant gay liberalism as part of the history of criminalization and uneven development, as they also posited models of activism outside the instrumentalism of scientific measure, social reform, and dominant left visions. Organizations such as the Third World Gay Coalition in Berkeley, Lesbians Against Police Violence in San Francisco, and this is one of their cartoons, which was responding to an attack on 2 lesbians by the police outside a lesbian bar, but also integrates into its response the question of public transport, the expansion of public transportation. Here, what interests do the police and the mission serve? A, the poor, just third world people, all gays, rape victims, the same people who brought us Bay Area rapid transit. So that gives you it. Dykes Against Racism everywhere in New York, which is here, and you can see they're organizing, you can't really see here, but it says Stop Gentrification and Stop Police Violence. Among many other organizations, were also key for how they challenged economic programs pushed ahead with the election of Ronald Reagan. Reagan's policies of privatization and market freedom helped to formalize the US's role in the global ascension of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism not only changed the structure of accumulation under capitalism, but it, along with the attendant growth of financialization, also reshaped the ideologies of everyday life to naturalize the market and downplay group inequality. These organizations claimed identity while disavowing its singularity, called on structural analyses while refusing the will to tabulate, and as such, helped to point to the crisis in liberalism during this time. Furthermore, I show how these examples of LGBT organizing should not be dismissed due to their admittedly short life and small scale. Rather, by considering these groups cumulatively, I suggest that they constitute a social movement that not only has been supposedly lost in the archive, but that has been disaggregated in its narration into false camps that place identity and culture on one side and class structure and organized movements on the other. The groups profiled in this chapter insisted, for example, that white identity held economic value in an urban land market, while they also saw a sweaty softball game or a newsletter or an art practice to all be parts of the struggle. Activists would follow a protest against the police with a poem, not only so they could hand it out at the next rally, but also as a means to facilitate conversations about how language makes history. Also at the start of the 1980s, activists who had become frustrated by the limits of grassroots organizing, including some members of the street patrols described in earlier chapters, were central to the founding of a new wave of policy-oriented anti-violence organizations, such as Community United Against Violence in San Francisco and the Chelsea Anti-Crime Task Force, eventually the New York Anti-Violence Project. Hi. Chapter 4 marks the birth of these organizations and their influence on the founding of the national anti-violence movement in the 1980s. While the impetus for local campaigns came from on-the-ground action, the institutionalization of anti-violence politics was fueled by a reliance on research. The inspiration for many studies was the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force and their anti-violence project, which was established in 1982 to address the issue of anti-gay violence nationwide. But it's also important to note that at the very same time, federal policies protecting crime victims also first came into effect during these exact same years, including the founding of the Office for Victims of Crime in 1981, the federal office. Fighting for hate crime laws soon became a top priority of the anti-violence movement. In this chapter, I sort of sketch how these went from a local to a national movement. One of the ambiguities of hate crime designation is proof of intent. Language tends to be the main determinant. Yet another factor is geography and how the location of violence, coupled with the identity of the accused, might prove violence has been spurred by bias. As a result, hate crime designations are effectively in the position to label certain areas as gay and individuals as either insiders or outsiders to these areas. Chapter 4 looks at how gay visibility was cast as a goal and a risk of neighborhood growth, and how this dual set of assumptions helped to define the essence of anti-gay violence as crime. This convergence of ideas was aided by two of the lesbian and gay anti-violence movement's primary partnerships in the 1980s, with the National Organization for Victim Assistance, NOVA, and the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. NOVA helped to provide a framework for understanding the injury of the individual crime victim as an attack on a broader group, and the ADL developed the model legislation for hate crime laws. But it's also interesting to note that the latter collaboration was at the very same time that the ADL expanded their campaigns on college campuses to assert that many emerging critiques of Zionism constituted anti-Semitism. The NGLTF's talking tours during these very years gestured at this link, citing as shared between gay and Jewish people the experience of the Holocaust, life with invisible marginalized identities, and the need for safety in protected territories. I analyzed the broader implications of these connections to the development of the national movement. Also central is the fact that while the first hate crime statutes mandated government documentation of bias, by the early 1990s, the thrust had shifted to the enhancement of punishment. Just one and a half. Chapter 4 analyzes the significance of empowering the state to arbitrate hate. By considering hate crime laws as but one strategy of constructing uneven geographies, this chapter forces discussions of violence in a culture of bias to include, in the plainest of terms, a history of real estate. I end in the 1990s talking about the activities of the once was organization Queer Nation and their own patrols that were modeled and forged in collaboration with the Guardian Angels in San Francisco and in New York City, among other neighborhoods. And I mark the simultaneous emergence of another Safe Streets Patrol alongside Queer Nation's patrols, the Christopher Street Patrol, that remained active in New York's Greenwich Village to this very day. Primarily run by residents and business associations, the Christopher Street Patrol was initially unaffiliated, yet often collaborated with Queer Nation's Pink Panthers. Over the next decade, though, the Christopher Street Patrol's targets narrowed, as I detailed in the beginning. By the turn of 2000, Greenwich Village residents were committed to heated claims that social service providers and non-residents were to blame for residents' low quality of life and lack of safety, as they called for police crackdowns on minor infractions like noise and loitering. Chapter 5 gives a close look at this debate and places it within a history of community-based planning in New York City. And it shows specifically how 1960s liberal reforms with which the book opens, like the war on poverty, can today provide the very mechanisms through which marginalized populations continue to be excluded from an increasingly privatized urban landscape. I analyze this in the context of policy claims that gay tolerance, presumably a measure of safety, positively impacts the success of the new, although now it's very old, economy in US cities. But as I said, Greenwich Village residents were not without opposition, and this chapter looks at the challenges put to them by activists associated with the group Fabulous Independent Educated Radicals for Community Empowerment. That's a picture from one of their protests. The 1990s saw the founding of a range of organizations dedicated to the combined fight against racial, sexual, economic, and gender justice, and many of them took neighborhoods and violence as their top priority. Although this chapter focuses on Fierce and its campaigns in Greenwich Village, it also looks at these broader organizations and asks at many of the ways in which they transformed, but also sustained some of the key terms of urban reform during this period. And this is a map that members of the Education for Liberation Project, which is an ongoing political education program within Fierce, crafted to redesign the possibility of a dream city. In the book's conclusion, I examine how some of the key themes, place claiming and uneven development, risk and speculation, social services and social movements, vulnerability and visibility continue to be mobilized together and torn apart, and I speculate about how queer organizing that takes on the terms of violence and safety might redefine those structures of injury and belonging that I have traced. Thanks for bearing with me. So, as you can see, it is part of the reason I had to read from this is the book actually covers an incredibly dense and long period of history. And I'm excited to answer any questions. I hope you will read it to learn about these pieces, about lesbians against police violence who created wonderful on-the-street skits and plays against gentrification they rewrote a series of classic hits from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s to anti-gentrification lyrics, and they staged them all over the streets of San Francisco, or Dykes Against Racism Everywhere that theorized racial capitalism like no one's business. So, any questions that people have or comments? Yeah.
So in New York City, anti-gay attacks have been increasing lately, and at least the high-profile ones are taking place in gay neighborhoods. And it seems like the press seems to attribute that to recent legislative victories like gay marriage. Do you agree with that?
You know, I've been thinking that an empirical study is actually needed to trace how rates of violence in media coverage correlate. When you go through the historical record, since the 1980s, not before then, but since the 1980s, every few years, a political issue is hailed as the reason for a spike in violence that does not always actually correlate to a rate of violence as opposed to a rate of reporting. So for instance, the Anti-Violence Project, when it was founded by the NGLTF in 1981, they set up a thing called Crisis Line. And they said that they needed Crisis Line because the new, it was in 1983, I apologize, in 1983 Crisis Line, that the new coverage of AIDS was creating a backlash and heightened levels of violence against gay men during that time. Well, what happened when they set up this call-in number is they received hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of calls. And those hundreds and hundreds of calls were for health care, hospital referrals, information about AIDS, fear, and 9 of them, I think, out of like hundreds of them were for reports of random violence. And so one of the things that is important is that this idea, and it was founded as an anti-violence hotline because of an assumption that that's what the crisis of AIDS was. And in fact, that was not the crisis for the callers. And so I do think that, I mean, in later, at that same time, with the election of Reagan and the sort of rise of the so-called religious and new right, there was a large discussion then that those were also causing high and increased levels of violence. And one of the things that's really interesting about these radical groups, and in particular lesbian feminist groups at this time, is that they understood how we understand a rise of violence to be often about how we framed what counted as violence or where it is. So that's not to discount that there might be at a particular time and place a rise, nor is it to discount that violence is happening constantly. But actually reporting and media coverage and backlash are actually very difficult things to measure and are much more about a political feeling than anything else, if that makes sense. So, any other? Yeah.
How would you compare the evolution of when I got to London, you know, Prince Charles had his bachelor party in Tokyo Joe's, which was a gay transvestite club, you know. And you go to the country parties, and everybody comes down in their frocks, you know, in the country states. And gay people just came to the table with all kinds of creative things. There was no problem. You know, it took me back to those. So my question to you is, has anyone done a comparative study of the evolution of the hate genre and in comparison to Europe? And what can we learn from Europe if we're learning anything?
Okay, so I'm gonna struggle answering that
I'm sorry,
question.
what?
I said I'm gonna struggle answering that question,
Okay.
but hang in there with me. So I know very little about the history of the gay movement in Europe. I do know, or about gay communities in the context of Europe, although early gay organizations were founded in Germany and in England that way predated the formation of organizations, although they weren't called gay organizations in earlier years. Also jumping ahead to more recent years, developments like hate crime laws have been largely exported from the US to the European context. And other scholars have shown the ways in which these kinds of policies have actually shaped and influenced gay politics in Europe to look more like US-based models in more recent years. In attributing for your experience, or what you might sort of suggest happens in that intermediate period, I mean, there's a lot of studies that have been done, and there's a lot to be said about what the dynamics have been between consolidating gay identities as clearly self-identified identities that are based in certain forms of community identification and growth, as opposed to the matrix of bohemianisms, deviancies, and other forms of social outsiderness that have characterized a wide variety of cultures within the United States and outside that experience different, if not qualitatively better or worse, forms of regulation. So to assert that there might be more in one than the other, I think it's not a comparison that I necessarily would make, but to see that there's a variety of ways in which sexual and gender non-normativity is regulated is important to not overly focus on the US.
Yeah, well, I was quite impressed with coming up with, Lord Byron was taught the defense and box by a black transvestite. You find these very interesting stories in English aristocratic culture, you know, that he was considered the best fencer in Europe. So you get these things, you know, and you get the social, for me, and I'm like, oh, right, you know, and France, the same thing, you know. I understand what you're saying about the institutionalization in the laws of the United States going across, but I saw quite a bit, I lived in Europe all my adult life, I saw quite a bit of exceptions.
But I would say that
On just
in
a
the
normal
UK,
live level.
I would say in the UK especially, there's a very class-based difference in, I'm English, so there's a very class-based difference in how difference is acceptable in general. So if you're a member of the upper class, it's not a question of money necessarily, it's a different thing. You can pretty much get away with murder, whereas if you're not, what you're allowed to express is very different. So I would say that a lot of that potential freedom that you were looking at was actually a class structure at work.
I also think, you know, another project that I'm working on right now, but it's not really relevant here, but I'm thinking about what are considered often the deviant pleasures of the aristocratic class on a global scale. And those pleasures are often considered in certain ways as aligned with the sort of deviant pleasures of a most submerged class as well. And so I'm thinking, and this other project that I'm working on looks specifically at the writings of Karl Marx on the so-called lumpenproletariat, which are understood to be both the most impoverished but also the most idle of the rich. And so I think that there is more to be said, and it's interesting about what those kinds of connections might be in unexpected sorts of ways. So at the same time that one is protected, of course, for different class reasons in different places. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your book and talk. And I was thinking about how maybe the project is also a lot about a sense of publicness, both in terms of the like violence that's enacted are potentially more public forms of violence, and then and also the forms of demonstration, the forms of like self protection. And so I was wondering if you could speak more about that in relationship to violence that happens within institutions, and then how those institutions are then sort of self-selected to protect the people within them, or the violence that's happening. So I'm thinking about, you know, violence that happens in prisons, and then also violence that happens, like for example, this summer New York State just opened the Center for the Protection of People with Special Needs, which is the first like 24-hour hotline where you call, and if you're living as an adult, as a developmentally disabled adult in a New York State run institution, but it's, you know, overseen by the state. So I'm wondering, I guess two things. One, what to do with that, and then two, if there are examples in your book or in your research elsewhere of sort of self-organized ways of protection that have happened with people who live in institutions.
Okay, so that's a lot there. Hold on, let me try to
Yeah,
remember.
sorry.
It was fantastic, thank you. I should have brought a pen up here. Okay, so let me say, backtracking, I think one of the things that is really, is not necessarily a focus of this book, but is something that's a theme that comes up regularly, are the ways in which institutions that imagine themselves to be institutions of care often are institutions of severe punishment, both in the ways in which they demand certain individuals to fit within administrative categories, which some people in the audience have written about, but also in the ways in which they demand a certain self-recognition within the terms that one needs to sort of identify in order to be eligible for those forms of care. And so you see that a little bit in this in terms of how there is, and then how that includes other forms of institutional violence. So one anecdote, if I can pull from the book, is when the anti-violence project, the NGLTF's anti-violence project was founded in the 1980s and 90s, they received a lot of letters from local anti-violence projects around the country. And in one letter that was written by organizers in Minneapolis, they said, we have this case of this transgender black woman who has received a lot of violence from the police, but we don't think this is appropriate for your report. So we haven't put this in our reporting, but I'm just letting you know because this has come up a few times. And so what's very stunning is to see that the very sort of structures by which violence is being recognized, identities are being recognized, are then also creating these categories of reporting and response, etc. So that's a little bit of that. The book does focus very much on street violence, and so other forms and somewhat police violence, but largely around the construction of street violence. So other forms of inside institutional violence are not covered that extensively here, but there are ways in which especially lesbian feminist activists in the late 1970s and early 1980s were making efforts to theorize a wide variety of institutions and places as related constellations of carceral control. There's a scholar named Emily Thuma who's doing really great work on the ways in which many of these same activists were doing the anti-violence organizing in relation to psychiatric institutions, prisons particularly, during this time period. Self-protection, absolutely. I mean, but in a range of ways that are expected and not. So many of the gay men who are organizing Safe Streets patrols, whether they called for police cooperation or not, they did understand this as self-protection. And it's one of the reasons that I personally have a hesitancy to even contemporary radical street patrol-based models of sort of community care that replicate those same forms, that they can often sort of have that same kind of policing form, even if their goals are not police collaboration. Most of the radical feminist organizations during this time period, though, saw self-protection to take the form of cultural art practices and reconfigured forms of kinship and domesticity. So they said, well, the protection we're going to find we are vulnerable in our neighborhoods. We are vulnerable to violence. We're not making an argument that violence isn't here. But the response is not to try to police our neighborhoods, nor is it to necessarily leave our neighborhoods. It's to reconfigure our kinship and domestic relationships to provide group care. I don't go into it too much, but there's a little bit of that there. Yeah, no, so I appreciate that. Yeah, no, I love that. I wish I could go into that more, but you do see these ways in which they invert, and they talk very explicitly about the fact that the problem is not violence, that they need to protect them, that it's not that state violence is, what they argue is that state violence is exacerbating the forms of vulnerability that they experience in their neighborhoods already, so that the solution of state violence will only aggravate those relations rather than remediate them. So that's part of it too. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm curious, and this is one of those potentially legally open-ended questions, but what sort of imperative do you think that your conclusions of your book set up for the designers and planners of tonight? How can the community, these major sort of authorized forces of the environment, actually respond productively to the critique that you raise?
Okay, it's an excellent question, and part of what I would argue are both reasonable and ones that other people would consider too utopic. So then we need to turn to those wild, avant-garde aesthetic dreams of those experimental designers and architects in the room, which is the ways in which planning has tended to have, and really as internalized in many ways, both dominant planning but also community planning alternatives, a very sort of symptomatic and instrumentalist approach to change, okay? So an idea that if one changes X, that it might sort of affect Y. That is the goal of many of these forms. In addition, planning also tends to sort of see forms of culture and aesthetic practice and everyday life as somehow separate from the economic and social policies that one enacts. And I really do think that for instance, turning to things like ELP's Dream City, thinking about these not just as sort of, both in the sort of fun visioning exercise of a shred, or whatever one does in sort of designing or planning a community's vision, but also thinking about these very seriously, about what kinds of unexpected desires are being met or pleasures are being met through city planning initiatives is one of the biggest, I think could be one of the most important things to do. But that is something that's very hard in a policy-oriented, zoning-oriented field of practice. On the flip side, I would say that community activists need to not necessarily always see things like zoning to always be a negative practice, and to see the ways in which sort of certain legacies of zoning, especially within the context of New York, have been among the most radical ways to provide for the protection of living wage unionized jobs and sort of affordable housing, and this has been all enabled by these things. So both imagining that these conversations are conversations that can happen together, that sort of ideas of sort of pleasure or desire or the fantastical, this site's an airport, like right downtown. And so, that's not gonna happen, but it does say something about the need for travel, a need to get out of the center of the city. Do you know what I mean? And how hard it is. So, okay, you're not gonna put an airport in the middle, but maybe you're gonna put a subway that goes to the airport. You know what I mean? And maybe this is what's going to help us get there. Do you know what I mean? As opposed to imagining these other processes. So it's a little bit there. Yeah.
I'm not even trying to phrase the question, but I'm curious as how you would relate the things you talk about in your book to maybe LGBTQ people who are sort of responding to the critique of police co-opted gentrification and these strategies by embracing violence as a strategy, anything from the history of Stonewall as being inherently anti-policing to back right now, or
you know, the sorts of different takes on identification as being queer with like a violent element.
Okay, so I'm not sure I understood, but I'm going to try and you tell me if I'm going completely off. Which is, if I'm understanding what you're asking, it's sort of how do I respond to organizations that often sort of within a radical tradition themselves see violence as an important move to, or as one potential response and move. Okay, so for me, I think that's a really great question. My first instinct is to first want to understand those organizations in the broader context of debates on the left, not necessarily strictly within LGBT activist history. And to understand that different debates, whether it's between anarchist and communist visions, whether it's about the place of revolutionary violence and anti-colonial struggles, the ways in which one can, I would encourage those organizations, if I were to sort of engage in that, in trying to think historically about a wide variety of ways in which violence has been theorized, and not to privilege the return of violence in a queer relation or in a gay relation to be somehow primary, rather than understanding the operations of violence in a deeper historical and global scale. So how do you understand revolutionary movements that have used violence, and to understand that historically and broadly, and that's what I would hope that such organizations would engage. And those would necessarily turn the terms away from the history of crime that I've outlined here, because I really fundamentally believe that the history of, that gay history and criminological history in the US are so deeply bound up with each other that to only invert the terms in terms of gay organizing would only be to participate within the same terms of violence that is the criminological frame. But if one were to think about the anti-colonial frame, if one were to think about it in these other contexts, I think there are other potential models and opportunities. With no insult to anyone in the room, I do not necessarily see that to be bashed back. But I think that that is still something that one can think about in a wide variety of other organizations. Does that get at it a little bit? Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. Hi.
In the past few years, I've been to a few of those community board meetings, comprised of some members of the same people who first organized that Take Back Our Streets in 2002 to 2004. And I thought one of the most interesting sentiments coming out of those meetings is that a lot of the folks who felt like their neighborhood was so under siege for over a decade, had started to separate themselves from the sort of more what they saw as upper class gentrification in the neighborhood, such as boutique owners or people who were investing in radically expensive condominiums after the completion of the High Line. And there's sort of this stratification happening, right, that affects the conversation that they have with community activists like Fierce, who, been demanding a 24-hour youth center in the community. And so I really wanted to sort of bring that into the room, because I've been thinking about it a lot, and I wanted to see, Christina, what you thought and what others thought about what that meant for where we're at right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. One of the things that is very interesting is that a perception in those early years was very much that most of the community board residents, or residents who would go to community board hearings rather, were necessarily occupied that sort of brand new, super rich property owning class in Greenwich Village. But that really wasn't the fact. A large number of them, and one of the things I talk about, a large number of them were the residents of the West Village houses, which, for those of you who are planners, were actually planned following and with the advice of Jane Jacobs, famed critic of top-down planning, okay, in Greenwich Village. She planned those and fought, and one of the biggest fights of the West Village houses when they were built in the 1970s was that residents were worried that too many gay people were going to move into these affordable housing that was covered by now expired Mitchell-Lama agreements that allow for affordable living within Manhattan, which is no longer possible. And so these residents of expiring Mitchell-Lama agreement houses were advocating for changes at the time that were really not in their class interests. And so one of the things that I think that that sort of demonstrates, especially in the case of those residents, is the durability of whiteness as a form of property, even among those who are not propertied. Okay, so whiteness was a very powerful force among those residents. But as also progressively identified, often sort of supporters of rent control laws and other things in the neighborhoods, I think that some of them were able and willing to be moved somewhat by the actions of organizations like Fierce to understand that in the long term, none of this was in their actual personal class or other interests, because these changes are transforming the neighborhood so much. So it's both interesting to hear, I haven't been to meetings in years, but to hear that, but it also makes sense to me. And you even saw that somewhat then. It's also because I do think a youth center that is 24 hours, that is in a designated place, that has a door, is a very different proposal than the calls for unregulated street life, which characterized the Greenwich Village of 10 to 15 years ago. And it is unregulated street life. It is not community centers that residents find so threatening, unless the community center draws unregulated street life, which they always will and do. So I'm not setting those against each other, but it is a different set of imagination. So they also collaborated in doing visioning projects with local designers about sort of redesigning the piers. And then those plans that were made by residents and Fierce members were totally rejected by the Hudson River Park Trust, because they're not interested in the residents either. They're interested in having the opportunity to build on the water, which was prohibited by waterfront zoning made by progressive planners 30 years earlier. Do you know what I mean? So they're not doing it for them, you know. So, yeah. Sorry, I get very animated. Excited here. Sorry. Yes. The Hudson River Park Trust. Yes.
I was wondering if you talk, because I was wondering if you talk about the production of safety, and you know, one of the things I've noticed in police accountability movement and anti-police violence is there's always comes back to this question of production of safety as being you know, the media or the general culture presents the police as being the dividing line, you know, holding back the violence, rather than violence being a factor of social and economic inequality, blah blah blah. And then, but then, what I thought was interesting of your talk was talking about like decades-old community policing or community-based approaches to violence that end up replicating patrol-based or surveillance-based state forms of violence control. And I think particularly in the you know, Trayvon Martin era, this whole notion that, you know, every 28 hours a black person is killed by someone, either police or acting on behalf.
Exactly.
You know,
that's an agent.
So, but I'm wondering, like, what do you think of, like, what are the possibilities of producing safety? You know, I know you talk about this kinship and but to me, one of the hard things is, like, in a large city or a big city like New York, how do you produce those lines of accountability and interpersonal relationships that produce safety when you don't know the people going down the street? You know, every day you may not see, you know, like so how does the scale of the city and then, I don't know, it's not really.
Yes, no, so there's a bunch of, I think there's a bunch of things in there, and I really appreciate that question, and I wish, like the other one, I'd have it more answered. I like to look in the past, and I'm not so good at looking in the future. So, but which is that, first of all, I do think that being able to understand and really critically analyze groups and individuals as to what they think is making them feel safe or vulnerable is an important political project. Like, people's sense of their vulnerabilities and their sense of these risks are so conditioned by these sort of unnamed other social forces, unnamed like racism. Do you know what I mean? That having those kinds of conversations be at the fore seems important to me. And that's some of the limits I've seen with things like community policing initiatives, because if they still haven't interrogated how we understand who belongs or doesn't belong, or who we recognize or don't recognize, and who we is in the first place, then those things will be replicated even by people pursuing often the most sort of radical forms or alternatives. But there was something else that you said that I actually had an interesting thing to say about, and now I've forgotten it, about
Scale of the city.
Was it no table in the street?
oh, wait, something, okay, you got a lot of words here, yes, I think I remember. So I'm really, so some other people who have, some other scholars and activists who have responded to gentrification have responded with an argument that, like, what we really need is to be nice to our neighbors, and we need to talk to our neighbors. And that part of the crisis of gentrification is that new upper class residents are not pursuing these forms of sort of intimacy and contact and sort of knowing. And I don't buy that as the solution to gentrification, but I buy that as an important way to build mass or local movements that will build on a mass scale. So how one can understand how one needs to be able to engage your neighbors, look people in the eye, develop relations across lines of difference, while also understanding that when you buy that house, you're changing the land market there, is something that I think is a really hard thing to do, those both at the same time. And so I really admire organizers who, for instance, to talk about things like police watchdog organizations and the biggest and the longest ones, were able to see how certain reforms might be necessary at the same time as one is going to reshape the sort of conditions of sociality, of community, and relations that might allow people to think about these things in different ways. So that doesn't really get at it, but it sort of points to that, you know, talking to people is really important, but talking to people is not what's going to actually change anything, so unto itself. I think we've gone over time. Is that,
well, that's
are we okay?
If anyone, there's more wine, so I would insist people proceed to drink some and continue asking questions, unless you particularly want to stand at the front of the room for...
No, thanks for listening to me, you guys. I really appreciate it.